This is a presentation about my work to date and joining the EthicsLab at Neuroscience Institute as artists in residence. So I'll be giving another presentation in the first week of December about the work that I've done here. What this presentation is about is mostly about the work that I've done to this point to help inform your understanding of my approaches here. So I was born just down the road from here. Don't worry, I'm not going to start there and then work my way forward, but I'm actually going to go in reverse chronological order back to when I was born. No, I was born not far from here in Mowbray, grew up in Mowbray. I was actually prompted to think about what my memories of Grootskeur are because I'm working here, and I remember being probably 4 or 5 years old and getting a palm tree thorn in my foot and having to go to the emergency room with my dad and sitting in the emergency room here, and an old man saying to me that when they take the thorn out, if I put the thorn into my slipper, then I'll get a rand coin in the morning. So I remember I looked up at my dad, like completely sincere, like, is that true? And my dad was like, yeah. Because we didn't do any of that tooth fairy stuff or anything like that in my family, but this old guy in the emergency room kind of pressured my dad into doing it. So I remember coming here from an early age, and I lived just down the road. So I'm going to start with my project, which relates most closely to my work here. And it's also one of the most recent art projects that I've done. So my focus will be on my artwork that relates to research and science. And I'm going to leave a lot of stuff out of my presentation. For instance, I have a bunch of public artworks in Cape Town. I think I might mention one towards the end, but there's a lot that I'm going to leave out of my presentation. So Bone Flute was work that I did not long ago, a few years ago, 2021 to 2023 at Humor at UCT. I was a research fellow for 2 years. I was working on a Carnegie-funded project looking at the intersection of healthcare and technology in Africa. So I was part of a group called the Future Hospitals team, and we were looking at the impact of emerging technologies in healthcare in Africa. Quite early on, I was introduced to an orthopedic surgeon at Tygerberg Hospital, Rudolf Venter, and he was introduced to me because he is friends with a few artists that I know, and he's a surgeon. He's very interested in the work that artists do, and he and his students study drawing with Leonard Shapiro, who's a Michaelis graduate who teaches, who's got a post in the anatomy department, and he teaches haptic methods of drawing bones. So I was introduced as, this is an orthopedic surgeon interested in art, and you're doing a project about medicine, maybe you should meet. So I went to meet Rudolf at his practice in Tygerberg. And what Rudolf is doing is he's developing low-cost methods for 3D printing patients' bones. So to practice atypical cases. So when patients have particularly unusual anatomy or surgery that they need, they scan and 3D print their bones and then practice surgeries on them. And they might do 4 or 5 preoperative rehearsals on the printed bones before working on the patient. It's significant for improving the outcomes for patients and also for using the surgeon's embedded skills, so their hand skills that they've developed over many years. So rather than working through a screen or a simulation, it's very hands-on, and that was felt to be very significant by Rudolf and the people he was working with. And it's something I was interested in this idea of like humans and machines working together in beneficial ways. It also reminded me of a few sources that I'd been looking at over the last 10 years or so. I'd got interested probably 10, 12 years ago in this imagery of skeletons playing musical instruments and skeletons mingling with living people in imagery from medieval Europe. This is an example of what's called the danse macabre, the dance of death, which is the time when illnesses were so prevalent in Europe and killing people in large numbers that death from illness was a part of life, and it killed people from all sections of society. And so this art form emerged which showed people from all walks of life, kings to peasants, dancing with skeletons. And it's imagery that interested me because it's both macabre in a clear way that it's about death and dying, but there's also a celebratory aspect to it, and it's almost like dancing in the face of death. And you'll see that combination in things like the Mexican Day of the Dead as well. There's this combination of death is present, but also let's live and dance while we can. And I'm also interested in related art forms such as the memento mori, which are artwork that remind us of death. So I'd started working actually a while back on the idea of making, taking a bone out of my body and making a flute out of it. And I was also inspired in my research by the real use of human bones for musical instruments in places like Tibet, though you find it all over the world that people make musical instruments out of bone. And the earliest instruments that we know of, the earliest instruments that we found are flutes made out of bird bones, so 40,000 years old. So by the time I had met Rudolf, I was already interested in this idea of bones and what you could do with bones. And so working with Rudolf, we decided that I would make this artwork using his processes, and I'd make a flute out of my own bones. In order to do that, I had myself scanned on the hospital MRI scanner, and I could do that because I actually had injured my leg running. So I entered as a patient into Tygerberg, had my leg scanned, and Rudolf took the data, sent it to a medical technology company. This was just a slide about I'd selected the MRI scan over a CAT scan because I was afraid of the radiation risk from CAT scans. But the night before I went in for the MRI scan, I realized I didn't actually know how MRI scans worked. So I phoned Rudolf and was like, what is an MRI scan? And he said, oh, well, it rearranges all the atoms in your body. It has them all reorient to the same position, and then it releases them and measures how long it takes to come back to normal. And I was like, I don't know if I made the right choice. That doesn't sound good either. Am I going to be the same person when I come out or not? So I went into the MRI scanner, had my leg scanned, produced a 3D model of my femur. So that's me holding it against my leg when I first had it done. And the way that we made this model into this 3D printed copy into a musical instrument was by using the same location and instruments as Rudolf normally uses. So that's part of my approach as an artist working with an institution is there a way that I can get involved with something that they already do there, and that way find out more about it while making something. And we also took the opportunity to make a short film about the process of working with a musician, Alessandro Schigli, who's a flute maker, and who was a friend of the medical technologist, Rudolf Venter, and myself. We all met in Rudolf's laboratory, and we marked and cut and drilled the bone in order to make it into a flute. And this is just the trailer, so there's about a 5-minute long video that shows this process. And my wife's a documentary filmmaker, and she was filming it. And then this is me playing the flute, the bone flute. And I'm standing in front of a wall of my medical scans. So there's I staged this in a gallery, and there was a window, and I placed my medical scans in the window. So part of the story that I sometimes talk about and sometimes don't, depending on the context, and I thought that with the context of being in a hospital, I would talk about it here more, is that I was diagnosed with cancer during the course of my work, about a year and a half into a 2-year research fellowship. And my wife was pregnant, was about 4 or 5 months pregnant with our first baby. Went for a checkup and had this diagnosis of colon cancer, and then I needed surgery. So I had urgent surgery, followed by chemotherapy. And this was all while I was making this artwork about mortality, a memento mori, a reminder of death, and that I was working in hospitals and with doctors. And that was quite extraordinary because it really gave me a feeling of meaningfulness to what was happening to me, which I think was a help to get through the process. So when we did the operation in the theater, I'd started chemotherapy. I was a few weeks into it. My wife was pregnant behind the camera, and I was working on this replica of my bone in an artwork that's about mortality. So it had all these extraordinary sort of resonances and intertwinings. And when I did the exhibition about the artwork, I staged an exhibition called Aesthetic Interventions in Artificial Intelligence in Africa, AIAIA. And I staged the exhibition in the studio building where I've had an art studio for the last 10 or 12 years, because they have a space that we can use. And again, I thought I want to make this at this intersection of my personal life and my research life and art practice. So I put it on the periphery of, it's on the street in Woodstock, and it's part of my art studio. And I installed the flute itself and the video that we took, and I also had imagery that could be rearranged to tell the story of the project. And one of the items that I had was a chart that charted over time, over the 2 years, my personal life, my artwork, and my research, and showed how these elements intertwined with each other. So these are visitors to the show. And this is Rudolf Venter talking at the opening of the show. And when he spoke here, he shared what the project meant to him working on it. And he said to the public things that he hadn't yet said to me, but he said, you know, that what he's enjoyed about working with me on the project is that I've helped to explain his project in ways that he hasn't been able to audiences and to the public, and that part of how I do that is through storytelling. So I tell a story that draws people in and has them understand the significance of what he's doing, whereas he talks in a technical language to other experts and doesn't have the same impact. So that was one of the things that he spoke about. And also on a personal level, Rudolf and I had a really interesting exchange. We talked about science fiction and music and art. When I went into the MRI machine, one of the things he said was, it's like being in a Berlin techno club at 4 in the morning. That's what it's going to sound like. It actually really did sound like you're in some gigantic music-making machine. So I'm going to take you back now to this is going to selected hits of my art production. So this is a work called Suited for Subversion that I made in 2002, and I'm going to show you the links between bone flute and the other material. But Suited for Subversion was a suit that I made when I was taking part in large-scale street protests in New York in the early 2000s. I was a master's student there studying interactive telecommunications, which is the creative use of computers and electronics. So I did my undergrad at Michaelis, my master's at New York University. And I was taking part in these protests and helping to organize them. And something I wanted to do was to respond to the boundaries that the state sets around protest and the way that the police control the movement of protesters. So I became aware of tactics that people would use to make their own protective gear. And so I made my own protective suit that was also a performance suit that had a pulse reader inside it and a speaker in the chest, and it would transmit my heartbeat out of my body. And it's actually, in some ways, it actually quite specifically is the origin of bone flute, in that this was the first artwork I did where I took a body part and a body function and repurposed it to make an artwork. So I'd played with the body before, and Jackie, I was thinking of you with this project actually, that this is a project I did before Suited for Subversion as part of my master's program. It's very white on white, but these are inflatable suits that can be worn by two people, and they're sound responsive. So when you shout in the suit, part of your suit inflates and part of the other person's suit inflates, like you're a lizard. So Suited for Subversion was made following this work as an extension of the idea of an inflatable suit. And because I was thinking about using parts of your body functions for artwork, I came up with another concept, which was handy ears, which was based on the fact that if you put your hands behind your ears, then you hear things differently. Yeah, so a friend of mine showed it to me outdoors. Yeah, you could put both your hands up and see if you can hear differently. So if you do that, things sound different. You get like certain frequencies become more prominent. So I thought, be great if you could do that, but still have a pair of hands to work with. So I had a special effects artist cast my hands in silicon, put them on a headband, and that's a friend of mine wearing them. So this is handy ears. lend me your ears. Put your ears in my hands. And so this was the second artwork that was a repurposing of parts of your body. And the way that I came up with Bone Flute was through I sat down and was like, I've done a heartbeat, I've done my hands behind my ears. What else in your body could be used? And there's lots of possibilities. But I thought bones are this durable, hard material. And I thought the biggest bone in your body is the femur. I'm sure you could use your bones to do something, and that's how I came to the idea of Bone Flute, which is why 10 years later, when I got this position at Humor and met an orthopedic surgeon doing this, I was primed to make an artwork. And I love serendipity. I love the intertwining of opportunities and ideas. So Suited for Subversion led me to my PhD work. So a few years after I'd done my master's, I was back in South Africa, and then I left again to Dublin and went to Trinity College, where I did my PhD looking at design for the developing world. The link between Suited for Subversion and my PhD material is that Suited for Subversion had been it hadn't been very successful at doing what it was designed to do, which is to protect me at protests. I'd made it, tried it on, and because I couldn't make it inflatable, I didn't have the right technology, I'd stuffed it with newspapers and made this very heavy suit. Here you go. And I felt like if I wore it to a protest and I got knocked over, I might suffocate. So I decided not to wear it. But a few years later, it got selected for a show at the New York Museum of Modern Art, put on exhibition there, and then bought by the museum, and it's part of their permanent collection, and it's been seen by millions of people over the years. People really related to the image it presented. So it became very successful as a communicative tool more than a functional object, but it had this combination of function and communication. So I started to pursue this idea of functional objects that communicate to audiences, and one of the places I found it in was in the then very popular area of design for the developing world, the New Wave, in about 2006. On the left is an object called the play pump, which is a South African invention of a children's roundabout that pumps water. It pumps water to a tank, and advertising is sold on the tank in order to raise money for the maintenance of the system. So in 2006, when I started my PhD, this was an extremely popular project. An advertising executive in South Africa had bought the concept from an engineer and had started to popularize it, and he got tens of millions of dollars from American aid programs, and they sold a bottled water that raised money for the play pump, and it was presented as the solution to the maintenance problem of developing world technology and a way of getting water without work. So I looked at it, and I looked at these images and videos, and I was like, this looks like an artwork. It doesn't look like something that's just a practical tool. They're using many of the techniques of art to tell a story, to have children involved in this project. I wonder if it works well. I suspect that it probably doesn't. How do I find out more about it? So I started to write my thesis as an investigation of the play pump. And part of what I did was I compared it to what was happening on the ground in South Africa in terms of the fight that the Anti-Privatization Forum was undertaking for the right to water in South Africa. The Anti-Privatization Forum took a court case all the way to the Constitutional Court against the privatization of water. And their approach was destroy the meter, destroy the prepaid water meter, and take free water as your human right. So I contrasted these two things happening side by side in South Africa, and I called my thesis Objects in Development, Radical Plumbers and Play Pumps. And I started to work between these two contrasting approaches to water and technology. So the destroy the prepaid meter is destroy the technology that is restricting your access to water. The play pump is install this novel piece of technology that will give you access to water. And so I started to investigate the history of the appropriate technology movement, in which appealing to audiences was never really important. It was more about the inside aspects of a technology. So I think Jantina, I don't know if you know the Anne-Marie Moll and Marianne Delay text called The Zimbabwe Bush Pump. It's one of their famous texts. in which they analyze this very successful example of an appropriate technology pump, whose function lies mainly in its internal workings, and it's cheap and repairable, and it's been rolled out across Zimbabwe and neighboring countries. And that's the Zimbabwe push pump over there with some children using it. So I thought, here's this history from the 60s and 70s of appropriate technology, what's happened in between. And I also looked at things that artists had been doing to provoke commentary around social issues. So top left is Michael Rakowitz's work, Parasite, where he made inflatable shelters for homeless people in Boston that plugged onto the waste air ducts of buildings. And he said about the work, this is not a solution to homelessness, this is a way of directing attention to the problem of homelessness. But at the same time, he equipped individuals, and those are some homeless individuals who are celebrating this act of resistance. Krzysztof Wojcicki is a famous example from MIT who did the homeless cart that looks like a bomb going through downtown New York in the 1980s. So he made these vehicles. He's got a whole series called Critical Vehicles, where he equipped people with vehicles that are meant to also communicate to audiences their situation. So he did it for immigrants and for homeless people. And then the artist Judy Wertheim produced these sneakers for border jumpers. So it's particularly current now. She's Argentinian. She went to the Mexican-American border zones, and she gave sneakers to prospective border jumpers from Mexico, whose production was funded by selling the sneakers in sneaker stores in New York. And the sneakers were equipped with things like a map of the border zone and a compass and the patron saint of border jumpers on the heel. And it was a whole project called Brinko with advertising and a media campaign. And it caused a huge controversy at the time, so she was called on to CNN and to all of the major news channels to answer for her project. And in that way, the idea is you get the ideas into circulation through a provocation. And at the top is the 1970s artwork by Childo Moreles called Insertions into Ideological Circuits, the Coca-Cola project. He was in Brazil during the military dictatorship when the media was suppressed, and he would do things like taking returnable Coca-Cola bottles, printing new messages in the same white type on them. For example, this one is a recipe for a Molotov cocktail, and then putting them back into circulation with the idea that they wouldn't be detected and the next person to get a refilled Coke bottle would have a recipe for a petrol bomb on it. So he had a whole campaign around this to do with money, printing on money, reworking items in society that circulated. So I got really interested in how artists were using this combination of functionality and communication. And the other area that I looked at is critical design. Critical design is an area in which people who have industrial design training work a bit like artists, where they design goods that are meant to question the society around them. So you use design as a fictional medium. It's critical design. And I brought all these lenses to bear on the play pump, and I also did my own field research of going and visiting play pumps in KZN. And what you typically see is the image on the left, where you see a play pump with no one around it, empty billboards, because after the first rush of enthusiasm for the project and companies wanting to associate themselves with it, the truth of the matter came out, which is that advertising to poor rural communities wasn't worth their money to invest in it. So the advertising-based model of maintenance died. And also what happened, if you see these photographs on the bottom of women pushing the roundabout by hand, is that children's play was never going to be sufficient to supply a community's water needs. The calculations weren't done correctly and no one tested or bothered to interrogate it. So what would happen is that adult women would end up turning these children's roundabouts by hand, which were less efficient than the pumps that they had before. So it was this catastrophic project, the play pump, in which all because the story was so compelling to audiences at a distance from it, that the users on the ground and their experiences of the project didn't end up mattering. And I figured out ways to diagram this and work out approaches to how to interrogate objects such as these. And I constructed a kind of analytic tool using the perspectives from interventionist art, appropriate technology, and critical design to analyze communicative objects. And as is the way with a PhD, 4 years of research boiled down into this diagram. Not quite, but I enjoy reaching that point. So this is an idea of what objects in development are in the context of my PhD, which is you have objects that have users in the periphery, the south, the developing world, however you want to structure that relationship, and have audiences in the first world, developed world, industrialized world, the center, however you want to describe those relationships. And when you have this split between users and audiences, then you get these predictable distortions of power in which objects that communicate well to these audiences get prioritized over objects that are good for the user. Okay, how are you all doing? Okay, good. I'm going to go now into the project that I started after I did my PhD and I came back to South Africa. So I was working first of all at the African Center for Cities, and while I was at the African Center for Cities, 2012, 2013, I started a project called African Robots. And African Robots was my engagement with wire art and wire artists. So this is my wire car from when I was a kid, like a wire car that I made. Does anybody know what car it is? It's the Deux Chevaux. Yeah, the Deux Chevaux, the Citroen Deux Chevaux. There was one in Harare when I was growing up, so I imitated it. So I made a wire car in imitation of the wire cars that I saw kids around me making. And across Southern Africa since the 1950s, kids have been making wire cars based on buses and trucks and things that they see in their environment. This is one that I bought in a small town in South Africa, just a very crude depiction of a car. I'm really interested and attracted to art that's made by non-artists and that comes out of an authentic engagement with the surroundings. So it seems to speak about an urge to represent and to use materials around you to do it. But it goes beyond being a children's art form and becomes an adult form in which adults who were successful at making wire cars as children, sometimes other kids' parents would buy wire cars from them for their kids. And as adults, they make wire cars and other wire objects and sell them as a means of making money. So you'll see wire artists all over Cape Town doing this. And I'm also fascinated formally by how wire, which is essentially a two-dimensional material, or something like a line, gets made into these complex three-dimensional objects like these sharks that you can buy in the street in Cape Town. But I was also observing that there was this overproduction of certain forms, and I thought, what if I could collaborate with wire artists and bring some of my training as an artist and a technologist into it, and start making new forms of wire art. So back in 2012, I met Dube Chipangura, and I had an intern from Royal College of Art called Enrich, who is a very skilled technologist and artist. And I put them together to work on making a robot version of the red-winged starling. I had a sort of brainstorming session of like, what animal should we make first? But we thought, let's make a mechanical bird. It's quite an icon, a mechanical bird. Base it on Nokia cell phone parts and 3D models that we've downloaded from the internet of simple birds. Take apart a Nokia phone and use the ringer, use the battery, and create an object that is possible but hasn't been made yet. And that's part of the concept of design fiction, would be instead of just writing about an idea, you might actually make a product or an object from the world that you're imagining. So this is me imagining you have wire artists, you have cell phone repair people on the same streets in Cape Town. What if they were to start working together and start making interactive electronic wire art? So this was our first iteration of African Robots. And then we reintroduced the bird to its environment to spread the word, activate yourselves. And from this simple start, I started to apply for funding from groups like British Council and Pro Helvetia. I went to Zimbabwe and ran workshops where I worked with wire artists to take apart cheap Chinese toys from Brazil reconfigure them and make them into other forms of art. I went to Maputo, to the markets there, and found out how wire artists work with old DVD player motors and make helicopters with rotors that spin, and we started making our own contraptions with engineering students and wire artists. And we started developing the project further, made fancier starlings, made barbets, and praying mantises. This was made by Michaelis students in a class that I taught at Michaelis in African robots. Termites that walk around and back off when they bump into things using a custom circuit board we developed.
Okay. That's good.
It's an owl that responds to light, and this is in Durban. And I started experimenting again with the idea of something that's like a product. So we started making these little solar-powered nightlight owls that were at Spear Light Art. And I even took the project to Korea. And so I participated in an electronic art conference in Korea where I met this Korean version of a wire artist who's a Buddhist lantern maker. And we made an octopus together, using found materials and his sculpturing. And it's called anthropophagic octopus. Anthropophagy is the act of eating culture. It's what you find in places like Korea and Brazil, is where culture from the West is consumed and reconstituted. So K-pop is an answer back to Western pop, for example. And this is the character for robot in the Korean script. And we also started working with science fiction material, making our own versions of a certain popular science fiction movie. Yeah, it's Star Wars, it's fine. So we made these meticulous wireframes that play on the association of digital 3D models and wireframes made by hand. Jason worked on this project with me. It's my friend Jason, who I collaborate with. We constructed a virtual reality environment in which we could develop the sculpture that's on the walls behind there, that's in a corporate lobby, which is a large-scale version of our SPACECRAFT project. So we started in 2012-ish, 2012, 2013, with African robots, and by 2019 we had got funding from the National Arts Council, and we installed this giant 6-meter-long half-ton spaceship sculpture in the Zeitz Museum at the waterfront. And that's the sculpture that you can hear. It's got a electromechanical music-making system inside it. And it's a memorial to Marcus Garvey, the Pan-African activist who set up the Black Star shipping line in 1919. So 100 years later, we launched an imagined spaceship version of his ship that was intended to take the descendants of African slaves back to Africa. Though it never succeeded in doing that, his story became very powerful.
Maybe talk about the biggest spring in. Check the game in the back, very black.
So we made a device based on an oil drum perforated with holes. His rotation controlled a cover of a dub track called Black Star Liner. So all of this is inside the spaceship. And then during COVID, we scanned the sculpture and we brought it into a virtual reality environment, which is a shared social environment in which people from around the world can put on VR headgear and visit the sculpture and socialize with each other in this sort of desert landscape environment. So this was Africa Culture Fund had a small art grant during COVID in which we did this work, myself and Jason. And in 2022, we took the work from the Dubship project to the Dakar Biennale, and we created this augmented reality poster that I'll show you on the back wall. And later that year, we took the spaceship and the poster to Ghana, where it's now in the collection of a Ghanaian artist called Ibrahim Mahama. And we made an application that if you point your phone at the star, then an animated version of the dove ship appears in front of it. And it's called Transportations Through Technology, the artwork with the poster. So it's the idea of being able to move the artwork across space. And just to mention a little tie-in with blown flute is we're working on a snake automaton that can play the blown flute. And our latest project that we're working on at the moment is now going into abstraction and functionality, where we've developed a modular sculptural system, which is extremely labor intensive. And part of the idea is, employment for wire artists, and then in which we have offshoots of toy-like versions of this system that we've developed. And this is a recent image of taking hot mesh, the name of the sculpture, for a walk in the Tankwa. But the entry point for me with the Neuroscience Institute was visiting the atrium here and seeing this amazing space full of light and high volume, and thinking about the material that I was working with, that I've been working with the past couple of years, called dichroic, and this is a work called Sun. So dichroic material is a film. It was originally developed by NASA as a gas deposit on glass for the windscreens of spaceships, and it has this property of shifting color according to what direction light comes through it. And I developed a proposal for City of Cape Town for a 2-meter wide public sculpture of this disc, of which this is a maquette, a 1:5 maquette installed at an art space in California, in which all of these discs reflect and refract light in different ways, responding to sunlight. And when I came into the space here, I thought this material has something really interesting about it as an aesthetic response to this space, and also the metaphorical possibility of a material that reflects and changes according to your perspective on it. And it just became it became an entry point in which I met Haley and said I'd be really interested in developing something. And that started to form into a residency in relationship to the work I'd done with Bone Flute, and became a way of interacting with the Institute while also pursuing this idea of a sculpture. This is an interior version of the system that's installed in a restaurant in Cape Town recently, in which instead of the sun, I'm using spotlights to illuminate an array of 20 discs that are spaced around the ceiling of this restaurant, and produce this complex overlay of different colors and patterns of light. So it's part of how I'm thinking of the mapping of this presentation and my work is across this whole spectrum of a kind of analytical engagement, with my PhD work, aesthetic work, such as this dichroic project, work that combines aspects of both of those, like Bone Flute, which is both a sculptural musical project and also the result of an engagement with other workers. And it relates to other work I've done, say, Jetty Square, and this is just one example of a public art project that I've done. On the foreshore in 2005, we installed these shark sculptures that are mobile. They move in the wind, so the tail catches the wind, and these sharks move on top of posts, swiveling in the wind. They have flutes in their gills, so that when the wind blows hard, they make a sound. And they're on a site called Jetty Square, which is where the sea used to come up to in Cape Town. So they're on the old coastline. And I was invited by an urban designer to co-design this project, and he did the tiling pattern and I did the sharks. And part of the concept was to haunt the space with the past. So this is where the sea used to be. It may be where the sea is going to be again in the future. And the sharks are there as messengers from the deep to talk to us on the site. And they just provide a great deal of pleasure to people who walk through the site. So it's something that I enjoy with public art, is providing an experience for people who are walking on their way from the train station and into town of something that is just unusual and tells a story and is just there for their pleasure. And the work, the dichroic work that I'm developing proposals for here would be a suspended work, like a mobile, which would take me back to one of my first artworks, which is my final year Michaelis work, and the last artwork I'm showing you. This was in 1997, and I installed these large sculptures in a train warehouse in Salt River that had speakers embedded in them, and in which I was DJing through multiple speaker arrays to create a sonic environment inside this train warehouse. And I like suspending things. So I've just got a couple of slides that are about the work I'm doing here. So these are my 3 artist-in-residence objectives. So it's a very short time in which I'm here. It's 10 weeks, and I'm almost halfway through. It's like we're week 4, going into 5, I think. So, but what I propose to do in my concept note for the residency is to investigate and respond. So that's the general work that I'm doing, like with Bone Flute, where I'm meeting with people, talking about their work, figuring out ways in which things that I hear connect up with other things that I hear and see. I'm also I communicated in the email I sent out about this, doing some deep hanging out, which is an anthropological term, which means to spend time somewhere in such a way that you are immersing yourself and you're not just a detached observer, but you're participating in what you're doing and you're learning from that participation. So I've started meeting with people, talking about their work, looking at things, studying things, working out ways in which I can respond and communicate. And so at the end of this, I'll be doing a presentation which will be in part my response to what I'm experiencing and seeing here and what I'm hearing from people. This to research the dichroic work, so to produce drawings, sketches, maquettes, models, which take the idea further of doing an aesthetic intervention here. And there's also the objective to frame an artist-in-residence program going on from here, which is how artists can be brought into the institution within a framework, and how we could develop that as a mode. Just to give you one little tidbit of something that I'm working on as a theme already that's been occurring to me through my work, is this setting up a kind of duality or an idea around the idea of material and immaterial as these 2 linked concepts. And some of the places in which I've seen this are to do with AI, for example. So we're looking at artificial intelligence and how artificial intelligence, the way that we access it, seems to be this sort of frictionless, smooth data process in which we get these amazing sort of interactions from AI. And part of the research that I've been exposed to is the enormous energy drain and the material drain that AI presents. So we have enormous server farms being built around the world to power this apparently immaterial interaction. So this idea of data and the material basis that enables data. But I think actually the starting point for me was mind and brain. So the idea of the brain as a physical structure and the mind as our experience that emanates from the brain, and being very conscious of being in a very specialized space around those ideas, just giving my loose response to that in terms of how physical changes to the brain get reflected in the mind and the consciousness, but yet there is something particular about a mind that we don't fully understand. So I think it's the hard problem is consciousness. So how do those things connect? And the reason why I've put immaterial in sort of scare quotes is because I don't know if anything really is immaterial. It's just our way of understanding certain things like data and mind and consciousness as not being as physical, as visible, as tangible as other things. And Erin, when I was with you a few days ago, I mentioned this concept responding to what I was seeing, the work you were doing with pangenomics, with the data, and then the physical manifestation. And it resonated with you?
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a thing we think about quite often, actually, is like how does what we're looking at actually play out to other people that aren't us, that are like so immersed in it.
Yeah. Yeah, because I was seeing on your screen rows of letters and sort of diagrams depicting these hidden or representing these hidden invisible processes that have this very material output. And the other thing that stimulated this concept was attending an ethics lecture, forum, with Heidi speaking, and I was with Jantina. And it was to do with the dialogue between Heidi and some of the medical workers from Skjø, where the subject was cultivating compassion as a way, and minimizing too much empathy, distinguishing these two things as you need compassion as a doctor to work with patients. Too much empathy means too much impact on yourself. The lecture was about, or the forum was about, navigating as a medical worker how to be compassionate to your patients, but not to be overwhelmed by what you're experiencing. And part of the discussion afterwards was medical workers saying, this makes sense, it's all very well, but what about the material conditions we're working in? And I think it's quite an open sort of conversation around how far do we try to deal with the responses and attitudes towards something, and how far do we try to deal with the material conditions that we're working with. And that is also where immaterial and material came in for me. So, and I spoke about this to Heidi afterwards, and again, resonated with this concept. So, yeah, this is a start to my way of thinking, which is to start mapping things around a simple hook and see where that goes and where it connects to. And that's one of my first artworks from when I was barely literate. And that's Table Mountain. And I'm calling myself Ralph Borland. So luckily no one in my family throws anything away, so I've still got this. That's my Instagram handle, which also, my Instagram connects to a link tree, which has lots of links to all of my research sites and projects and things like that. So yeah, thank you very much for your attention, and happy to talk about it. Hi, Zoe.
Sure. I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on the role that humanities more broadly, or an artist more broadly, can play in the sciences. And in terms of, I'm particularly thinking about this light fractal and how it might possibly also be a metaphor for the different disciplines that are involved in this whole enterprise of not just neuroscience, but all the aligned disciplines in the space. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks, Zoe. So, yeah, to approach that from a sort of an angle, I was sitting in this lecture theatre, Hedley Twiddle's presentation a few weeks back, and then I was like looking at the logo over here, and I was going, oh my God, that looks so much like the dichroic material I'm working with. Just, I mean, incidental things, like I gave samples to people here of little discs. So you have little circles, and you have different color spectrum across it, and you have this networked kind of structure, which is what the mobile that I have in mind would have some of those characteristics. And I hadn't, sort of consciously taken in this, and I'd been working with this material and the structure independently before I even came in here. But it just does, it's like that serendipity which does something to me, where you go, maybe there's a connection, there's something that's going on here, and that something that I've really tried to learn to do in the last few years, so only in the last probably 5 or 6 years have I really started to do this as an artist, is to try and trust instinct. Because previously I've found myself in this split between, there's an issue that I'm interested in, but I also like making things. How do I connect those two things? And it's a problem I've talked about with other artists who have a practice that's to do with being socially engaged or trying to have impact in a certain way, is what about just making a drawing or a sculpture? But that's not going to do something in this other area I want to work in. So how do I connect those things? So Bone Flute was one of the first times in which I made an object that I was interested in making and an experience, but also worked with someone from another discipline and found out more about what they did and communicated it. So when you ask about what arts and humanities can do in relationship to other fields, for one thing, on a broad level, I think there's freedom of movement as an artist, where you are allowed to traverse domains. And I like that freedom, and I've thought about that from very early on in art school, where I thought, I'm interested in so many things, but if I do art, I feel like as an artist, I can participate in all of these things. And there is a kind of enlivenment or shift of perspective that I think that artists can bring to an institution, where they respond, reflect, take things in, connect things, maybe get people to interact with each other in different ways than they have before. I mean, there's so many different types of artists and types of art that it's hard to generalize in some ways about what they do. Leonard Shapiro, who I mentioned, is all about how doctors and medical students can learn more about anatomy by doing drawing and feeling bones and so on. So it's quite a specific area of art. I think what I'm interested in is, kind of a play with symbol, metaphor, communication, interaction, and to try and keep developing and following this intuitive process that I feel like I'm getting in touch with and that I think yields results. So I think that's why I started to shift, was I actually saw results coming out of following intuition. So you've got to follow that trajectory. It's kind of a long answer.
Do I need to microphone?
Maybe just to, I think, in the recording.
Okay.
Thanks. So I'm sure you know the artist René Magritte, I think, with the "This Is Not a Pipe" piece. And when you were talking about your wire art, it made me think of a sculpture or a set of pieces that my grandmother actually has at home by a rural artist. I can't remember what his name is now. I tried to do a quick Google, but he's not Googleable. So I'll try to find his name and email it to you. But he does wire sculptures that sort of resemble road signs that have the same sort of "this is not art" vibe, and it's more of a like commentary thing. Do you feel like what you do sort of falls into that bracket as well, of like not just art, like it's more than that sort of?
Yeah, I think I might know the work that you mean, because there was somebody like that. It was I remember in the 90s his work being highlighted. So, I mean, one of the categories, genres that art gets seen through is the idea of outsider art, which is people who don't go to art school and who are making out of some other urge. It does remind, when you ask about my own practice, it does remind me that one of the very important touchstones for me, which I haven't explicitly mentioned, is interventionist art. So Childo Morelos, the Brazilian artist with the Coke bottles, is an interventionist artist. So is Michael Rakowitz. So is Judy Vertine, who did Brinko. And that was the chapter title in my PhD, was Art Intervenes. So the idea of interventionist art that comes from the 1920s till now is the idea that artists don't need to just represent things in society. They can actually make what happens in real life the material of their work, and that they can seek to intervene in society directly. So you don't just make a picture of something or make a sculpture or a photograph of something. You take the real material of the world and you use that as your material. So my work with wire artists is an interventionist art project, in that I saw wire artists on the streets making and selling their work, and I thought I'd like to interact with them, make work with them, represent and transform, sample, transform, redistribute their work. And so that's an interventionist mode. And similarly, that's what I'd bring to a role like this, is intervention in the sense, and I think intervention is also a term in medicine, I think, as well, but I would be making real life material the material of my work, and definitely interested in function and impact and not just representation. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, firstly to say, wow, really great, really wonderful oeuvre. I really enjoyed your presentation. Thank you, Ralph. I was just wondering about your the bone flute, and just like also just rippling off what you just said now of the idea of functionality and everything. So I get that you are the serendipity and the connection that you have with the doctor or the whatever, the technician, the surgeon person, and then you, and then the idea with the 3D thingy, all of that stuff. I was just wondering and so I can see so he's got a specific mission, right? And then you've kind of interpreted that in a particular way, in an artistic way. And I was just wondering, so I can see that loop, but I was wondering how that functions in the world and your connection with the surgeon, how that imagination and that kind of reappropriation of this bone might function beyond helping somebody that's lost a limb. But I just started thinking about like what's it called? Phantom pain, for example, right? So amputees so their bones, might there be an initiative that those bones, that leg that has been chopped off, that that could be used as, because you also mentioned something about pleasure and how that is the functionality of that. Might there be another ripple of this association with your surgeon? And if that has been discussed, that can move beyond the two of you and into the world to the actual, I don't know, survivor of I don't know what the correct medical terms are, but like the amputee, for example, that can actually then have use of the limb that they've lost and find pleasure out of it in some kind of a way.
Thank you, Jackie. Yeah, I mean, there could be. I think that one just practical example is that people engaging with the work, like at the exhibition, visiting the exhibition and seeing it or learning about the work, is they have said things like, oh, I had knee surgery. I wish that I'd known about this before I had my surgery, because then I would have known it's an option for the doctor to have practiced before they did the surgery. Or people might say, well, now that I know about this technique, perhaps that would be available to me when I need a procedure done. So there's one sort of close example, I guess, which is as a communicative project. And I think I'm associating with what you're saying about the idea of the phantom limbs and the amputees and the making tangible. It makes me think of somebody having a body part printed or reproduced in a way that they can view it or attach it or feel it, and that it could have some function to them around it. Yeah, I do see that. It would be interesting. And worth pursuing. I'm quite interested in the brain-computer interface prosthetics that I've been reading about. That's another example of something that is a real-world, cutting-edge application of how people can have amputated limbs replaced with prosthetics that are controlled from their brain. And if you think about artists like Stellark, the Australian artist who's been pushing these boundaries for many decades, he's done that kind of stuff as artwork, having his mind control another arm attached to his arm. Yeah. So there are, if you look at the bio art area, which is its whole other science art area, they often do work that could well advance medicine or advance science. Like they're actually using it in quite a practical way. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Anya, did you want to say something?
Yeah. Thanks, Ralph. So I was very struck by the phrase you had, functional objects that communicate to audiences. And so across sort of your different artistic expressions, what principles guide the kind of messages you want to communicate or tend to communicate, and to which audiences?
Say it again.
What principles guide or tend to guide the kind of messages you want to communicate, and to which audiences?
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things it makes me think of is that is the scope of the artist or the artwork to not always be about positive outcomes. So you can also have, so there's this area which I used to also relate my work to, which you could call provocative technology. Provocative technology was a little mini genre. And provocative technology was about producing, say, a tool or a piece of equipment that might actually be quite negative or dystopian. And it was meant, so the design duo, Dunn and Raby, there's an image I thought about including here, but couldn't get my hands on it. They do things at museums like producing a depiction of an energy-scarce future in which people use their own blood as an energy source, and they have these very beautifully designed little teddy bear-shaped blood bags that children extract their blood and use it to power their toys and appliances. And that arena is to do with you're designing an object that depicts a dystopian future, a negative situation. So I guess I'm just at the beginning just associating with what you're saying about what are the parameters of what you want to communicate. Not necessarily all positive functions. Perhaps you can highlight negative tendencies as well. I think the public in a broad sense is who I want to communicate to. I've done public artworks. So for example, I did a public artwork which Jason also worked on in Belleville, which are these giant grasses growing out of the ground. So they're made of metal, and they're about 3-4 meters high, and they're exaggerated scale grasses. And we designed it in such a way that the paving breaks up, and these grasses emerge from cracks in the paving as a depiction of what grasses do anyway on a small scale. And the lower leaves of these grasses are benches, that you can sit on. And I didn't even tell the city that these were benches. I just designed it in such a way that they could be used as benches, which is a response to the way that the city often designs out ways of sitting in public. So I designed in a way of sitting. And I was also responding to the way that the site that I worked in Belleville is a very immigrant community. It's many Somalians and Pakistanis who are more recent immigrants to Belleville. And I wanted to draw attention to the way that grasses can find nourishment in small available resources. And I thought that if I depicted this, maybe someone in their daily hustle in that area would get the symbolism of I'm taking something small, tenacious, and humble and blowing it up and monumentalizing it and also making it a resource. So in that case, I want to communicate on some level, symbolic felt level or conscious level, to the people inhabiting the space with a supportive message in a way, like a kind of, to help in some sense.
I think we're about to end now. But I was struck. I was struck by the water pump and the anti-privatization forum, and thinking about fees must fall and bringing that back into this space, and certainly the neuroscience and the work that the EthicsLab does, and your question about taking the work, being subversive, but also then what's the politics of that in the world, I guess is what's in my head about this. And I don't have an answer, but it's kind of like thinking about those things together, about what's the politics of the work in this space specifically? What is it that we want to demonstrate with the beauty of what we do, the challenges of what we do, which I'm new in the Neuroscience Institute and with the EthicsLab, but there's a beauty there too. There's both and that's part of, to answer what I would think about what is our contribution. It's to be able to show the contradictions and the tensions. And so I'm only saying this because I saw the anti-privatization forum and how you depicted that there, and somebody who was very much part of it. I thought, oh wow, I wonder how, if I felt, my response was like, a strange response to that, how women from the Anti-Privatization Forum would feel in their representation of how they reconnected an inappropriate technology which stole something from them and turned it into something really beautiful, an art of resistance, an art of an ethics into our country. So I'm thinking about how we bring those tensions and contradictions to the fore, because then there was an appropriation of a politics there, which was really important for women in Soweto, for instance, that reclaimed a skill at multiple levels, a technical skill to be able to recharge and reconnect without resources, but there was something profoundly ethical there in that principle, as opposed to saying, oh, which is what many people then also said in Cape Town, oh, they're breaking technology, or they disband, which is not actually what they did. They did something quite subversive as well, and was an art and a beauty in that. I think that was reclamation of self. So I'm just thinking about the work that you're doing and how that then gets to be the politics of what we're wanting to do in the, I don't know if the NI or the EthicsLab is wanting to do that politics, but the politics of making visible the contradictions, which I think is not unimportant in the context of Cape Town and certainly the Cape Flats for me.
Yeah, so that was 2006 that I started that project, and at the time I was I was quite connected with the Anti-Privatization Forum and the Soweto Electricity Crisis Committee. So I went out with the activists there and knew some of the organizers in it. So I was fascinated with the work that they did, and what I learned how to do during my PhD thesis was how to interpret their actions through the lens of science and technology studies, where you can talk about programs and anti-programs, or scripts and descripting of how the technology had a script in it about how you should behave, and how the user descripts it or creates an anti-program to answer the program of the technology. So I was doing this kind of mix of my own engagement with activism and then this way of understanding it, in a very practical way of what they were doing, and in some ways it turned out also to be a kind of documenting of a period and an action. Yeah, I think it is interesting to think about the application of those ideas here, especially a public hospital. I think where my interest lies at the moment, and that's why I highlight this was almost 20 years ago that I was doing that work, is that my interest now is probably more subtle. Like, I'm interested in how those issues could be approached or depicted, perhaps through form and metaphor, but I'm also at the same time quite open. Like, one of the sources that I've been looking back to is a Ghanaian science and technology studies scholar called Josiane Tanchu, who I've been communicating with recently. Her interest in STS in the hospital is about gateways and entrances and exits, and it's interesting when you traverse the hospital and the Neuroscience Institute and think about all the ways in which the hospital connects up, and what happens, going through the security gate to come into Kutaskur, and yeah, so there's definitely lots of interesting material there. Yeah. Also, just to mention, I was in a forum with Graham when Heidi was leading the ethics, one of the ethics, clinical ethics seminars, and it was a very privileged access to be in the room with people from the CEO of the hospital to nurses and doctors in their scrubs, and a whole array of people all talking about their engagement with the hospital and what it meant to them, and a lot of material that came out of that was, yeah, as I say, privileged to hear it and encounter it. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we wrap it up. Sure. Okay. Thank you, everybody.